Good morning. I'm glad to see each and every one of you that chose to be with us this morning. Indeed, some of you are visiting. In fact, several of you and some of you for the first time. Let me say thank you. We are glad you're here, and we hope you know while you're here that you're wanted and made to feel welcome. We love our visitors, and we're glad you're here. We want to ask a favor of you. No, I'm not going to ask you to stand. But if you'd take just a moment and locate a yellow visitor card on the pew rack in front of you, and if you haven't done so in the past, will you take just a moment to fill that out so we could have a record of your attendance, and also so we can know we gave you an opportunity. If you had some sort of need, you could request that. Maybe you're interested in a Bible correspondence course being mailed to you, or had a question for me or the elders, or some other sort of spiritual need. You can indicate that there, and we'd be happy to help you and be a resource in any way we could. You can put that visitor card, incidentally, in the collection plate as it goes around, or there's a wooden box as you leave, or you can just hand that to me, and we appreciate you doing that for us. I would like to mention, in way of announcements, if you have children between the ages of 2 to 5, you can have them dismissed to a class geared towards their age group. And they'll be directed to a classroom just back and to their left, and they can have a age-appropriate lesson. So we encourage you to take advantage of that for children between ages 2 and 5. The other ages are in here with me. And we have an interesting lesson this morning. In fact, a series of lessons, and they'll be somewhat different than maybe we're accustomed to. We'll be looking at some proofs or some evidences for God. When I say the word proof, I don't want to be misunderstood. And by proof, I mean lines of proof or evidence. So we'll look at that over the course of the next 4 weeks to be more specific. Today we'll be zeroing in on or focusing the evidence for God's existence from the argument of cause and effect, or really we'll argue from effect to cause. It'll make sense in just a minute, or I'll make the best sense of it I can. I do want to give you the plan or the outline for the next few Sundays so you can schedule to be here, or if you're absent, that you will go back and watch the archived video, or we can send you audio files. But I want to encourage you that this is a series of lessons that I hope you'll tune into in their entirety. And if you're not able to be here for whatever reason, that you'll get a copy of them. So today we're looking at evidence for God from the argument of cause and effect. Next week the plan is, Lord willing, that we'll look at the argument for the existence of God from design and order specifically. And then the third installment will be an argument for the existence of God from the morality that exists and transcends our mere senses or subjectivity, and we'll talk about that. And then the final one will be an argument that is ours to address. If we do make evidence for the existence of God, then we find ourselves having to defend the God of the Bible in the minds of some who will suggest, if God is good, why are there so many bad things and evils and suffering, and why do children get cancer and the like? And so that'll be the series kind of rounding out these arguments for the existence of God. Now let me say, I would assume in the audience today that a grand percentage already believe in the existence of God. I appreciate that. But I also appreciate that we live in a world that isn't that way. And that you work with and have friends and family members and neighbors and people in your extended circle of influence who don't believe in God at all and think the idea is almost absurd. What I offer you in this series of lessons is some reasonable evidence for the existence of God. Now, I must give a disclaimer. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not a physicist. In fact, without spell check, I probably wouldn't spell either one of them words right. I'm no expert, I'm no scientist. But I do have the ability to reason. And that's what I'm offering us in this series of lessons. So let's get started. Actually, what we're doing in today's installment of this series of lessons is looking from effect to cause. Reasoning or arguing from effect to cause. What do I mean? Well, the material universe exists. There was a slight effort for a relatively short period of time, and there may be still some that propagate it, to suggest that reality is merely an illusion and there isn't really a material universe. Now that's just absurd. We're all here. There's a universe. That we live on a planet. There's a star that is our sun. We live in a solar system. I mean, that's real, made of atoms and molecules. I mean, we're really living in a universe that's made up of, well, matter. But if it exists, and it does, that's conceded by most everyone, it's logical. It must have some sort of cause. It must have some sort of cause because the effect is evident. We see it. We live in the material universe. So what caused the universe? That's what we'll look at this morning. Now, there are basically three suggestions, arguments, line of reasoning to explain what was the cause of everything that exists. Now, there may be 42 different ways that you could look at it, but I think it would basically be in one of these three categories. The first of which is the universe itself. The material universe itself is eternal. That it's just always existed, that matter has always existed. Time, space, and matter is described or defined by infinite regressions. In other words, it's just always existed. That's one theory. Another theory that explains the effect. What was the cause of all of us existing, of all the material universe existing? What caused it? Well, the material universe is not indeed eternal, but it created itself. We'll talk more about that. And then the final of these categorical arguments for the existence of, well, the material universe is that it indeed is not eternal and it was created. That's it. Those are your three categories. And so what I want to do in this lesson, I have a real simple way of outlining it. I'm just going to kind of look at those three. And so let's go on this journey together. I don't know if you're familiar with Stephen Hawking, but he was probably one of our generation's most notable, I guess, atheist physicist. He wrote several books. One of the books he wrote was called A Brief History of Time. And in that book he said this: so long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose it had a creator. But if the universe is really completely self-contained, having no boundary or edge, it would have neither beginning nor end. It would simply be. What place, then, for a creator? And he's right. The idea that there is just an eternal material universe does not require anyone to create it. Why would you need to create it? It just always has existed. Perpetually and infinitely go back. There's no time. It's just complete eternity, infinite, or the material universe. However, he says, and I agree with this too, if it did have a beginning, then it's likely and logical and reasonable that someone or something created it. So let's talk about this idea of the universe being eternal. Because in his wisdom, he said, if it had a beginning, then it's very reasonable to suggest that someone created it. But he would argue it didn't have a beginning, that it was just eternal. Again, this notion of infinite regress. Infinite just means forever. Regress just means go back. And it's idea of, well, matter, just molecules, immaterial, non-living and living matter all together just have always existed. Thus, there's no starting point and no beginning. This is one line of reasoning. And the most modern effort to do this that I've discovered is something called the multiverse theory. Ever heard of that? And the idea is that our universe, while it may appear to have a beginning, that it can contract back to itself, and it has a seed of a beginning, but that just came from another universe. And that beginning and expansion of that universe just came, y'all with me? Another universe. Okay. That's again, it's the same idea that material matter, everything, just has always existed. It didn't have a beginning, just an infinite regression. Y'all with me? I know it's kind of heady, but I'm breaking it down as simple as I know how. Here are some objections to the notion that the universe is eternal. Here, we'll get kind of practical. I don't know if you know much about the second law of thermodynamics, but if you know much, you probably know a little more than me. But the second law of thermodynamics is scientific observation and extrapolation from observable and mapped out, extrapolated science. The second law of thermodynamics. And I'll give you the gist of it from what I understand. It basically means energy is dissipating or decreasing. Let me give you an illustration. Let's just say I turned on a flashlight and I set it right here and I said, okay, we're going to come back and look at that flashlight on Wednesday. And I'm just going to leave it running the whole time. The beam that comes off that flashlight, what would happen? It would decrease. It would decrease in energy and be less and less of... Have you ever studied about the life cycle of a star? The scientific observation and mathematical equations that can be put to that from the science and discipline of physics will tell you that, well, we're losing energy. And if we're losing energy, then it had more energy before, and so it must have had an origin or beginning when it had... There was a time when it had more energy, if now it has less. The same thing is true of this idea of the earth wearing out. Even the book of Hebrews suggests, no uncertain terms, that the earth is growing old like a garment. That's the second law of thermodynamics. You really don't need to call it the second law of thermodynamics. You just need to get old. Stuff wears out. And the idea is that this is a law, and it tells us that, well, if we're losing energy, or if things are wearing out, then they must have had a prior time when they had more energy or they were younger. Apart from the movie Benjamin Button, we all appreciate that we had a beginning, and when we had that beginning, we were young. Had young skin and young joints and over the course of time. Well, we can observe that scientifically from our own material universe. And so the second law of thermodynamics points to that fact. Here's another one that's observable, scientifically measurable, that the universe is expanding. Now, this did not used to be the theory of mainstream science, but it was the efforts really on the part of two men. One you've heard of, and the other you've heard part of his name. One is Albert Einstein and the theory of relativity, that he was trying to measure the universe in part. And then we have Edwin Hubble. You probably recognize the Hubble from the Hubble Space Telescope. He's the inventor of that. And in his observations of the universe and Albert Einstein's equations, they came to a definitive conclusion among science that the universe is expanding. Well, why is that relevant? Well, if it's getting bigger, then at one point it used to be smaller, to the point that it had an origin. And so that's led people to extrapolate that there was a big bang. And then that began to explain the origin of the material universe. Well, in part. Well, I'll get to that more in a minute. Another observation that we can make is pretty obvious. Motion. In other words, if something is set in motion, then, well, someone had to set it in motion. Let's just suppose we go back to one of these back classrooms and we walk in and we open the door, and in the middle of the table there's a quarter spinning. Well, nobody's in the room. There's nothing evident. What would you extrapolate from just simply seeing a quarter spin around in the room? Well, somebody, put that on their finger and flicked it real good and got the thing to spinning. There was some force independent of that, acting upon that to cause it to begin in motion. Pretty simple. Are we in motion? I don't know much about science. I'm no, physicist, but from what I understand, the earth is spinning. You can look at the picture we just observed, and the earth spins, part of the time it doesn't have the sun, and it's dark, and the other side has the sun, and it moves. How did it begin to go in motion? Well, something had to act upon it. There is the effect of the earth spinning and it going around the sun and so forth, the solar system. Here's this argument that the universe itself is eternal when there is evidence that science agrees upon that it had a starting point and it began to, have the laws that govern movement. All right, there's just a few lines of reasoning to think about in regard to this notion of the earth being, or the universe rather, not being eternal itself. And a lot of scientists have come to this conclusion, noteworthy scientists. There's a renowned physicist. He's Russian, and he is renowned for his work and being a cosmologist and being a renowned physicist. His name is Alexander Vilenkin, if I'm pronouncing that correct. And he said this: "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. they have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And they have. And this lends itself to this notion of the Big Bang and an origin or a beginning. And that's the more prevalent view, that most people that are unbelievers will not adopt the notion that the material universe itself is eternal, but it had an origin or a beginning, and thus introduce the Big Bang or other theories. But most prominent, the Big Bang. But most scientists have conceded, suggesting that the material universe is eternal is flawed, fallible, that there's evidence to the contrary. And I just touched the hem of the garment of that evidence, and I'm no expert in it. The universe caused itself is the other theory. This is the one that's, I'm not trying, again, I'm no scientist. Y'all know that. But this just seems so illogical. No one or nothing created everything out of nothing. Let that one sink in. Now, I'm not making this stuff up, although it sounds convoluted and almost an oxymoron of terms, but no one or nothing created everything out of nothing. That's the Big Bang, really. There was this almost undetectable speck of material. Nothing to attribute acting upon it, no explanation for its origin, but that it just began. What comes out of nothing? Do you know I have no fear at this moment that a hippopotamus will appear above me and drop on me? I have no anxiety about that. I have plenty of probably illogical anxieties. That's not one of them. Why? Because nothing will spontaneously appear out of nothing. Do you know what that sounds like to me? A miracle. So the notion that something can appear out of nothing, that no thing or no one created everything out of nothing, that sounds like a miracle. See, as you know where I'm going with the lesson, obviously by our setting and circumstances this morning, there was someone who created everything out of nothing. So if you postulate that no one or nothing created everything out of nothing, or someone that is transcendent of the material universe, something that is supernatural, that is metaphysical, acted upon nothing miraculously and created everything, well, at least you've got the supernatural to attribute the miracle to instead of nothing. If a hippo just spontaneously created itself out of nothing, and well, I would think that would require some forces beyond the natural. What is nothing anyway? One philosopher said nothing is what rocks dream about. You'll get that on the way home. Could we define nothing as the absence of time, space, and matter? Now, I will argue that that's a pretty decent working definition anyway. The universe was indeed created. That just lends itself to logical sense. That there are certain evidences that are undeniable and scientifically proven that allow us to dismiss the notion that the material universe itself is eternal. And the idea that, well, a non-eternal material universe sprung out of nothing by no force and just happened. That seems illogical. But it does seem quite logical that something that is independent of a beginning of time, space, and matter created time, space, and matter. If time, space, and matter had a beginning, whatever started it couldn't be made of time, space, and matter because they didn't exist. And so what I offer as an alternative to the notions that are popular among those who are unbelievers is a transcendent being who is uncaused, timeless, immaterial, and powerful enough to create. I want to ask you to go with me to Psalm 90. And some of you are thinking, I didn't even think we needed our Bible this morning. Psalm 90, look at verse 2 there. Psalm 90, look at verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or even you had performed the earth and the worlds, formed the earth and the worlds, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You know, we sang the song just this morning and highlighted this description God gave himself to Moses. I am. I exist. In order for the effect of time, space, and matter, we have to have something that is outside of, independent of, or transcendent of time, space, and matter to act upon it, to cause it. The uncaused first cause. It would have to be timeless, this mover, this one that was the agency with which we see time, space, and matter. We'll look at these verses in just a moment in 2 Timothy 1 and verse 9, where it tells us that, well, before time began, God had considerations. And we think about our verse where we opened up. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning is our time. The heavens is our space. The earth is our material. These things didn't exist. They sprang into existence. He spoke and the world existed. There was something that was required to start this that was not governed. God is not governed by time, nor space, nor material. He is non-material. Jesus, describing the Father, said, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. As Paul described this to the Athenians, and they're trying to understand the gods, he said, the God who made the world and everything in it doesn't dwell in a tabernacle or a box or a shrine that you can create, but he's spirit. And then we have to have something that has the power or ability to create. Go over with me in the book of Romans. Look at Romans chapter 1. Look with me there in verse 20. A familiar verse to many of us. There's this reminder of, well, the simplicity of God's ability. Look at verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead or divine nature, so that they are without excuse. There's been an effort to excuse the need for God by suggesting that the material universe, us, everything in it, it's just always existed. And if you go back far enough, it explains it, well, just matter's eternal. It always has existed, always will existed. Or to suggest, well, that everything that exists began, but it created itself out of nothing and independent of any agency or act upon anyone. Really? In an effort to excuse a need for God, those are the hypotheses, those are the suggestions, those are the theories. You know, I don't offer proof. I can't display the Almighty and you be privy to undeniable proof. See, God requires faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. But we can have a reasonable faith. And it's logical. And it's reasonable. I just keep coming back to that word. That there was a divine creator who began the material universe. I want to ask you to go one more verse, and I'll wrap up some of my thoughts for this morning, and we'll reserve some of our thoughts for next week as we discuss the design and order and the mind behind the creation. But look with me at Hebrews 1 and verse 1. Because this whole time, really, I've only been trying to advocate for a divine being who spoke the world into existence, to an agency that is timeless, immaterial, and spaceless, and was able to, by his agency, create the world. But that doesn't get us anywhere near the God of the Bible. That just gets us to a divine being. But as we look at Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, we're reminded that God wanted to relate. God wanted a personal relationship with his creation, with those that he made in his image, you and I. And so he decided to reveal himself to us. And one of the things that we'll mention tonight is he revealed himself progressively. In other words, he began to reveal himself a little and a little more and a little more and a little more. And then ultimately, he revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. He said, I'll just take on flesh and dwell among you. And if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, Jesus said. And if we look at Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, he revealed himself. But he goes on to say in verse 2, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Peter said on a particular occasion that he had the prophetic word confirmed to him. And he appealed to a scene, an occasion, where he, John, and James were segregated to see what we call the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus literally changed his form before them and showed his deity. He basically peeled back the layers of his humanity and showed that he was the divine nature or the Godhead bodily. And then Peter mentions that he heard the voice of God from heaven say, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him. This final revelation of God was in the person of Jesus Christ to present to us the gospel, the good news. The good news of his death, his substitutionary death, to rectify the problem of sin and to put a covering over people so that they could be holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. Not just a God who created the universe, but as we'll note, a God who offers us, well, the gospel. Before time began, we're told in 2 Timothy chapter 1, he had a plan by his grace to send his Son to abolish death and bring immortality to light. That's the hope. A God not only who is powerful enough to create, but benevolent enough to care. And to demonstrate that care on the cross. He's asking you to come out of the world and be cleansed by the blood of his Son and be in communion and fellowship with him eternally in the place that is independent of time, space, and matter, in the place we call heaven. Is that your home? Have you obeyed the gospel? Have you confessed Christ and been buried with him in baptism for the remission of your sins? You can do that this morning. Or maybe you have some other sort of spiritual need. We want to encourage you. If you're subject to the invitation, come now while we stand and sing.